Welcome back to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, January 10th, 2025. On Fridays, we cover human behavior and justifications, my specialty, but probably everyone's to varying degrees as well. But let's kick things off with what I hope you'll find to be a fascinating subject dealing with one of life's big questions. What do I mean? Well, a few years ago, I participated in our first year student orientation week as a speaker in the college's Pechakucha night. The event involved several presentations organized around a common question. So the big question that night was, do you agree or disagree that humans have the right to modify the natural environment to suit their needs? Since many incoming students are unsure of what they'd like to study, the idea was to have speakers from diverse departments and programs address a common issue. And so that evening, we had presenters from art, biology, engineering and English, geography, information and media studies, music, philosophy, and yours truly. So the students enjoyed a wide range of answers to the question from different perspectives. As the final speaker, I was hoping to show the value of integrating knowledge from across all branches of learning. And so I used Greg Henrique's Tree of Knowledge system, which I'll introduce in just a few moments. First, you see on screen here the cultural pyramid of knowledge, built upon a foundation of mathematics, rising through the natural sciences, social sciences, arts, and humanities. Philosophy, you'll note, sits atop and informs every subject, especially since every form of knowledge requires different sets of philosophical assumptions. Now, Dr. Greg Henriques, he's a friend of mine, and he developed an especially insightful framework for demonstrating the interconnectedness of knowledge through what he calls the Tree of Knowledge system, the TOK or TALK, not TikTok, that's something entirely different. And I chose his approach because it helps to unite multiple strands of intellectual thought and different frameworks for understanding the changing and evolving nature of the universe. And the TOK maps essentially the four dimensions of behavioral complexity that build upon but cannot be reduced to lower levels. And by mapping knowledge in such a fashion, we're better able to understand why organisms and animals and people behave so differently from each other, and especially so in comparison with inanimate objects or matter. Consistent with modern science, the Tree of Knowledge tells the story of a universe that starts as an energy singularity and erupts via the Big Bang, leading to cosmic inflation. Almost instantly, all the energy that exists was created, with the energy matter space time grid emerging. The first dimension of complexity refers to the emergence of the physical forms or organizational forms known as matter, which occurred by our current best estimates about 13.8 billion years ago. We understand matter to refer to everything from subatomic particles to the eventual evolution of stars and galaxies. And these latter phenomena have been especially influential in terms of helping us to understand how the Big Bang set our universe in motion and indeed created the conditions that were necessary to evolve to the next levels of informational complexity. But what do the stars and galaxies have to do with humans? Turns out everything. Hubble first found the evidence that great visual evidence of the galaxies as receding over time, and especially what you see there through the deep field image of the galaxies. We learned and confirmed that hydrogen and the light elements dominate. Cosmic background radiation was detected back in the 1960s, and we've now most recently confirmed the existence of gravitational waves. Most important for our purposes are the estimated 200 million trillion stars, which eventually die violently. And in their dying stages, stars release unimaginable amounts of heat and energy. In the eventuality that stars explode as supernova, they forge the elements necessary for the next evolutionary stage. Hence the lyric, "We are stardust," from Canadian icon Joni Mitchell's famous song Woodstock. And speaking of the 1960s and 70s and musical icons, George Harrison released What is Life on his 1970 album, All Things Must Pass. Well, in our more local environment, we've determined that some 4 billion years ago, matter organized chemically to produce life on Earth, the second dimension of complexity. We just don't know exactly how that happened. And since we weren't there, it's difficult to test our current theories. We have a lot of suspicions, a lot of hypotheses, we've done a lot of experimental work, but we still don't know exactly how life emerged from matter. Nevertheless, the sheer diversity of life forms that developed attest to the remarkable flexibility of evolutionary processes. From the modest beginnings of prokaryotic life forms, we are confident that replication, variability, and natural selection help produce this incredible richness in the variety of life forms and organisms, the likes of which we're perhaps never going to know the full range of in terms of what exactly has inhabited our Earth. And from life, of course, more than 3 billion years later, new creatures emerge that we call animals, which sense their surroundings and move with central nervous systems. Unlike cells, animals are mental creatures, and as such, the term mind encompasses the TOK's third dimension. Although there are many challenges, obviously, associated with studying mental behavior, psychologists and neuroscientists have created various measurement techniques and strategies to document the exchange of information via neural networks, as well as cognitive processes and increasingly sophisticated methods for assessing consciousness. Finally, a raft of changes occurred that led to the evolution of hominids and the genus Homo, of which only Homo sapiens has survived. That species created culture with shared symbols, syntactical language, collective memories, and history. And while human beings share much in common genetically with some of our ancestors and certain mental qualities with other species, there are some respects in which we are qualitatively different from every other species. For example, human beings have developed a remarkable capacity to evaluate information and render judgments about that information. And as such, we are the evaluative creature. This dates back at least to Plato, where we can divide the world into three different forms of evaluation: the beautiful, the good, and the true. And while the evaluative schemas can overlap and some people seek integration, the questions we typically ask usually are aesthetic or artistic in nature, moral and ethical in nature, or scientific and logical in nature. The Pechacucha question for that evening was clearly a should or ought question, or a moral type of question, asking whether humans have the right to modify the natural environment to suit our needs reflects a normative as opposed to an aesthetic or scientific question. So, there are indeed many nuances to consider if you're going to accept or reject the notion that we have the right to modify or perhaps exploit the natural environment for our own purposes. Change the words even slightly, and we convey a different meaning. But simply asking the question tells us a lot about the human species. So rather than attempt to answer definitively a moral question, I have a rather different agenda as a social scientist. I strive instead to explain why people frame their positions the ways that they do. In other words, why they may or may not agree with the premise that we should exploit the environment for our own for our own ends, and how the knowledge that we process helps to shape our views of these issues. The fact that we can even ask this type of question reflects 13.8 billion years of cosmic evolution. Certainly, other animals communicate, they have their own forms of language, some even use tools. But humans are unique in that we alone justify our thoughts and actions. In 2018, I had a chance to spend a few minutes alone in discussion and in conversation with Dr. Jane Goodall. There's our photo together. She's one of the world's leading primatologists and experts on chimpanzees. So I asked her specifically in our conversation, in her studies of conflicts and violence amongst chimps, did they ever, to the best of her knowledge, attempt to explain and justify their use of violence? She understood what I was getting at immediately, and she quickly answered, absolutely not. Only humans, in other words, have developed the more complex symbolic forms of communication that allow for a shared understanding of our unique place within the environment, and for which we have to then develop rationalizations and justifications for our behavior. So, from a TOK perspective, language and self consciousness co evolved to permit something called intersubjectivity, or a window into the minds of others. The way Dr. Henriquez explains this is that our self consciousness has metaphorical blinds that help regulate how much the public sees. The tripartite model that you see presented here suggests that we have an experiential self as an animal, that is to say, we all have a biological reality, a private narrating self that converts experience into our verbal thoughts or a psychological reality, and a public self that converts experiences and shares these experiences with others through language and other forms of communication. This is our sociocultural reality. And also note that all of these realities are built upon complex interconnections of matter, organized through the flow of energy, emanating from the most basic building blocks at the subatomic level of material reality. And yet, as we reveal our thoughts, we quickly learn that such openness creates or can create problems. We learn, therefore, that we have to explain ourselves to others. And in turn, they might disagree with, they might be displeased with what we reveal for varying reasons. The language based portion of the human brain then kicks in to create narratives that legitimate and justify our actions to others. We are storytellers. We are justifiers of one kind or another, regardless of the cultural media that we might use. And this may arguably be the most fundamental source of our human conflicts, at least from a cultural standpoint. We have to process information, establish the nature of the symbolic content that's being communicated, and then determine the degree to which that information aligns with our own understandings of reality, not to mention our own interpretations and our own preferences and interests. And that applies to the whole cultural person, not just their language, but the way they look and sound and smell and represent themselves across the full spectrum of communicative forms. And so, even though we are 99.9% genetically identical, we've learned that culturally humans can be vastly different. People don't share the same language and stories, not to mention ethnicity, genders, religion, or worldviews. And as these differences increase along different dimensions and across other cultural spheres, the problems of communication and truly understanding one another become even more acute. So, a fundamental sociological wisdom then states that the greater the cultural distance, the harder it is to understand one another. So, the map that I've presented there compares the United States to other countries through measures of cultural similarities and differences. And guess what? The greater the cultural distance, the harder it is to understand one another. Just with language, for example, if you consider people that speak English only, sure, they can generally understand one another quite readily, but it becomes a little bit more complex if their accents or their slang usages differ from one another. And even more difficult still if they speak dialects, for example, from having grown up in different regions. Or perhaps we speak different languages altogether. What if both people don't speak English? One speaks German, for example. Well, this makes it even more difficult, of course, to communicate and understand one another. But at least with English and German, they share a common root as Germanic languages. So there'll still be opportunities perhaps to understand one another. But what if we move even further away in terms of cultural distance and linguistic difference? What if one person speaks a Germanic language but another a Japonic language? Well, then the chances of finding common linguistic ground reduce considerably, and our challenges of communicating get even more and more difficult. So, on the basis of language and countless other cultural attributes, human beings establish their own groups and cliques or tribes with unique membership rules. Every cultural grouping establishes boundaries that help distinguish between members and non members, or in the extreme, between us and them. We create powerful origin stories and narratives to justify what makes us special and what makes others them and perhaps not so special. Indeed, they don't belong, and in the extreme, they might be devalued as inferior. Sometimes the othering process yields such harsh evaluations, as you know from human history, that non group members are dehumanized, not even considered people. And under the most extreme circumstances, we justify all kinds of mistreatment and subjugation, violence, and even genocide. What about our pets? If human beings can be located so far from one another in cultural space, what happens if we consider non human animals? Well, obviously, cultural distance increases further. We may anthropomorphize some animals or view them as rather human like, especially our own pets, and that can result in more humane treatment, especially if you're talking about the family pet. Yet a sharp divide still remains between humans and pets. Nor do we typically eat our pets, for example, especially those where we've bestowed a formal name. But there are many sentient animals with minds that we kill with impunity. They're part of our diets. And indeed, the comparative evidence confirms that the vast majority of people who populate the world's largest societies consume animals or animal byproducts at least weekly. So there can be no question that human beings have long modified and exploited the natural environment and many species for our dietary purposes. What about other life forms? Well, once more, as cultural distance grows, so does our lack of relative concern. If ants and cockroaches invade our dwellings, we become veritably genocidal, don't we? We exterminate them. We spare not a moment's thought of their well being. Strict vegetarians and vegans still consume myriad vegetative and plant based forms of life. We modify ecosystems constantly to produce the foodstuffs necessary for our own survival, regardless of how sustainably or responsibly we think we're accomplishing those ends. And yet, rarely do people speak of the possible pain and suffering of plants, though some might. And some even argue, for example, that trees are sentient entities as well that communicate with each other. But even if we were aware of plant life in this sense, or we viewed plant life as worthy of special protection and consideration, the concerns for other living entities would vanish almost entirely, with trillions of bacterial and other cells living within our bodies. We're killing microbiota constantly. And the cultural distances that separate us and the evolutionarily complex life forms, such as human beings, or from the simplest to the most advanced, ensure that almost no one worries about the well being of the microscopic world, unless or until some of the microscopic world's inhabitants, that is, I should say, might threaten our own health or existence. And finally, what about other forms of non living matter? What about the right to modify the natural environment to construct our own shelters or to clothe ourselves? Inanimate matter, to be clear, is not even life by our standard definitions. Can we at least agree that we should not worry about using non living material to help ensure our own safety and survival? Apart from paleontologists, erosion specialists, and selected others, who would argue that we should even really care about rocks? The cultural distances between people and rocks defies any reasonable measurement metric. Yet, while Paul Simon once sang, "A rock feels no pain," one can certainly approach rocks and inanimate matter in a different way as well. At the very least, rocks do share something in common with human beings. They behave. Everything behaves. Everything changes. Everything's in motion. Everything that exists, by definition, is part of nature, and that includes us. Now, interestingly, although indigenous peoples typically didn't have the same kind of scientific knowledge that we possess, they've always understood the deeper connections across the universe of matter, the earth, other species, and our place among them. Stephen Schwartz captured the philosophy of animism lyrically in that song from Pocahontas, the theme "Color of the Wind" or "Colors of the Wind." And one of the lyrics is, "I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name." So what's the point then, if everything matters, including matter? Well, at one level, or that of vibrations and movement, everything can be classified as part of the same universe, the same reality, as it were. We know that as humans, we have culture that has emerged from our minds, which emerged from ourselves as living organisms, all of which are comprised of various combinations of physical matter. But of course, a human being and a culture and a soul, for that matter, cannot be reduced to physical matter. Or can it be? That's a broader philosophical question. Okay? A core principle that emerges that helps place our question of our right to modify the natural environment in a more scientific context might be: the further removed we are from our understanding of connectedness, the easier it is to modify, exploit, or destroy anything to serve our needs. And that principle follows naturally, logically, from the universal laws of existence. We, in every facet of our universe, need energy to combat the second law of thermodynamics, or that inexorable march toward entropy. Whether we are animists or capitalists, we have to establish efficient means to harness energy to ensure our own survival. Everything falls apart in time, including us. As human beings, we know that energy transfers are absolutely vital to sustain our bodies, and yet these will dissipate as well over time. Our metabolism will decrease and then cease, and we will die eventually. The cells in our bodies will revert back to their subatomic state at some point in the future, and entropy ultimately always prevails. The Earth itself has perhaps only about another 5 billion years or so before it'll be swallowed up in our own sun. So we can return then to the Pechacucha question once more with a decidedly different understanding of the human condition and our place in the universe. In fact, we might modify the question to ask not about our right to modify the world, but rather how best to interact with an open system of nature and harness energy to stave off entropy. Well, whatever the answer, the fact remains that we are the only species, as far as we know, to pose that question in the first place. So whether we have the right to modify, manipulate, or exploit the environment, we must acknowledge that we do. We have, and as far as I can see, we always will. We cannot survive otherwise. I mean, we have to eat, right? Of course, the winter weather might impede our plans from time to time. I'm obviously not firing up the barbecue that you see in the photo there under the current conditions. I just took that photo today. So, note to self, buy a barbecue cover. But the point is that as the justifying animal, we have to decide where we fit in the eco tapestry of life, what we most value, and what practices we think to be the most sustainable for our lives and those of future generations. Unlike every other known species on the planet, we have no choice except to debate the impact that we have. And that may be the most important goal, I think, of higher education or for anyone who hopes to understand life's big questions. Let's hope we can, as they say, choose wisely. For now, thank you for listening. Let's have some fun tomorrow with sports and humor. That the first in that particular series. And until then, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. Hope to see you tomorrow.